I couldn't help but immediately think of the 2024 Nobel Prize, which was awarded for the research on the relationship between colonial institutions and economic prosperity. And I feel that can actually form some interesting connections with the unified growth theory, particularly the role of human capital formation in the transition from stagnation to growth. So, in this context, I wanted to ask you, how would you assess the long term impact of the British introduction of modern Western style education, often at the expense of the indigenous systems or the development of human capital in these regions? So, on one hand, you have the problem of the colonial institutions sort of ensuring that the areas that they're controlling don't industrialize, and because of the lack of industrialization they don't develop the requisite human capital formation to move towards the post Malthusian age. But on the other hand, you also have the introduction of direct education, which brings about the requisite human capital formation. So would you say the impact was a net positive or negative? And I would also appreciate if you could give your take on the 2024 Nobel laureate work.
Yes, so this is an interesting question, and as you said correctly, human capital is central for unified growth theory. To a large extent, the argument is that in the course of human history, there was a gradual buildup that ultimately led into the emergence of human capital, and it is the emergence of human capital that triggered ultimately the demographic transition, freed the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population, and permitted societies to sail into the sustained growth regime. So when I think about the work that is done on the role of institutions, and particularly the role of colonial institutions, to a large extent, the viewpoint that is advanced by the authors of this research is that the dominating force is, in fact, the adverse effect on the emergence of political institutions that persist over time. The nature of these political institutions tend to be non-democratic because of the conditions that existed in terms of population density and the beneficial elements of extraction. And as a result of it, this is the dominating element. Now, I think that trying to evaluate how important is education relative to the detrimental effect of persistent extractive institutions should be done in the context of individual countries. So as I said before, when you think about the relationship between India and England, it is certainly the case that the trade relationship between the two was not very complementary to India in the context of human capital formation, in the sense that ultimately it forced India to specialize in goods that had limited human capital content. And as a result of it, despite the fact that the British were engaged in establishing some sort of education system so as to train a local elite that can help the English bureaucracy, the overall effect, the popular demand for human capital was suppressed and consequently was not really, was not necessarily the dominating force. So I think that one will have really to evaluate in the individual context. Human capital undoubtedly is critical for the process of development, as I said, partly because it contributes to technological progress, but more importantly, because it forces this demographic transition to trigger the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. But whether this is sufficient to dominate other forces, it's really depending on context. If you would ask me in the context of India, whether this is in fact overall beneficial for human capital formation, my hunch will be that it was not beneficial, despite sort of the the foundations for modern education system, overall, the demand side was missing. And as a result of it, it's not clear to me if education would not have emerged in a more pronounced fashion even earlier in the absence of the Brits.
Thank you so much, sir, for that response, and also because it also allows me to ask a follow-up.
Please.
So my question pertains to that asymmetric trade that you mentioned. And so I've been studying the modern economic history of India this semester. So this is something that came to my mind. At least based on my reading of the paper, the comparative origins of economic development. Sorry, the colonial origins of economic development by AJR. And if I link those concepts, for instance, whether inclusive institutions were implanted in regions where there was a complete replacement of population vis-a-vis regions where extractive institutions were planted, at least when I look at the British Raj, post 1850, post the 1857 war, for instance, I find that the land tax was very low, for instance. So, in the predecessors of the Raj, taxation could be as high as say 50% or even 40%, for instance. The estimates vary, but it was rather high. And say due to the permanent settlement, the tax went as low as 10%, say in the early 20th century. So that's quite, let's say, at least a relative reduction, if still higher than other countries. At the same time, a lot of the nationalists critiqued the integration with the global market, but I also find that there's a gradual integration of the domestic market, because India was a very diverse country at that point of time. It wasn't really a unified country the way we now perceive it to be. And there was a linkage between, say, coastal markets with the global economy, Bengal, for instance, where I come from, or Kerala, for instance. And at least one explanation of this capital accumulation that I find, say, the way Wallerstein defined it, was that you had a strong state, say there was a strong state that aided in primitive accumulation of a few capitalists. So let's say in between these two, between a statist interpretation of, say, the sort of capital accumulation you talked about, and between, say, an exaltation of laissez-faire, the way inclusive institutions, property rights, low taxes, and so on. How do you, based on your unified growth theory, perceive both these extremes? And do you think that the Raj is really the best example for, let's say, talking about extractive institutions?
So it's, I mean, as I said before, it's a bit complex, and not being an expert on and the economy of India, I'm not in a good position to really evaluate it in the context of the Indian context, but more broadly, as I said, there are different forces that are operating. It's very complex. I mean, so there is an element, as you said, if you think about India and the construction of the railway and infrastructure that naturally was not necessarily designed in order to benefit the Indian society. It was simply designed to assure that, in fact, resources are shipped efficiently to Europe. And then ultimately there were consequences that were not necessarily anticipated, or were not sort of behind the mindset of the British administration at the time, that benefited India. It generated, as you said, economic integration and ultimately political integration. It generated sort of an initial infrastructure for education that persisted and ultimately permitted the modern education system that we see at the moment in India. But at the same time, as I said, there was sort of major hurdles in the context of development, and the major hurdles that I see predominantly a sort of specialization in goods that are very problematic for economic development. Specialization in goods that have very limited human capital content, and as a result of it are not conducive for development. specialization in goods that have not only very limited human capital content, have very limited technological externalities, very limited spillovers from a technological viewpoint. So I think that this is, when I think about the big picture, this is my feeling is that this is the dominating element. But again, it's not a black and white story. I mean, there are different shades of gray that one has to take into account. And one needs to conduct a more elaborate sort of comparative study about all these forces and what is ultimately dominating. But it's a very complex question, naturally, to address properly from an empirical viewpoint. Naturally, you can span the different possibilities, and you see that some of them strictly positive, others are marginals, some of them are strictly negative, but sort of evaluating the different forces is relatively complex and difficult.